So, as mentioned at the end of last lecture, we have a working code here, but we have a lot of duplication. We're not duplicating the exact same words. These constants are named differently. This logic here is different. But the overall logic, the overall structure is, of course, exactly the same. And if we think about a more complex form like this one, which actually isn't too complex, but which has at least 3 inputs, then we would be repeating that same structure, that same code in the end, 3 times. And that's not what we want to do. So instead, we typically want to outsource some logic somewhere. We don't want to retype and repeat it all the time. And how can we best do that? You could consider creating a separate input component so that you replace this code down there with the input component, and inside of that input component, you then have that logic for validating it, for checking its touch status, and so on. And that would probably work. That is something you could do. The only thing that could become a bit more tricky then, or where you would need to find a solution, would be for managing the overall form validity. Because if you manage every input as an individual closed thing, and you know if the input is valid or not, you then also need a way of letting the overall form know if it's valid or not. And that could certainly be done with props and passing functions to props and calling them from inside the input component and so on. But there also is another approach which I tend to prefer here. And that would be a custom hook. We can use a custom hook to manage all that state logic in there. And let me show you how we could do that. For this, I'll add a new folder in this project here. I'll name it hooks next to components. And I'll then add a useinput.js file because it will be a hook for managing the state and the logic for an input. So in here, I'll add my useinput hook function, and I will export it as a default here. And now in this hook function, I want to manage the value of a given input, the touch state. I want to infer its validity, also combined, of course, with the touch state. Now, of course, this hook should then also be flexible, though. The concrete validation logic should be passed into the hook from outside. But that is something we can build. And I'll start by copying the entered name and entered name touched states here and add them in the useinput function. For this, of course, here in this useinput.js file, we need to import useState from React. Then I'll rename this here to entered value and set entered value to make it more generic. And that here is touched and set is touched. Now, as a next step, we can copy our inferred state here, so to say. So these two constants, entered name is valid and name input is invalid. I'll copy those and also give those better names. I'll name the first one value is valid, and the second one could get a name of has error, because in the end here we control whether an error should be shown or not. Now for value is valid, I check the entered value here, and for has error, I then use value is valid, and if it's not valid, combined with is touched, I find out whether we want to show an error or not. Now this validation logic, however, shouldn't be hard-coded here. Instead, I want to get the logic for that from outside, where this hook gets used. But that's no problem. We can expect a function as an argument to this custom hook function. Let's say the validate value function. So I expect that this parameter receives a function as a value. So that here, for value is valid, I can execute validate value and just pass in the entered value we currently have. And then this hook could return something. It could return an object, could also be an array, but one of the two because I want to return more than one thing. And in this object, I'll return the value, which is the entered value, I'll return has error, which holds the result stored in has error. And since we got the same names here, we can use the modern JavaScript syntax of just listing this once, and it'll automatically be expanded to this here behind the scenes. And we will also need a way of letting the component that uses this hook set the entered value and set the touched state thereafter. Now, for that, we could go back to simple input and copy the name input change handler into use input as a function, and copy the name input blur handler into our hook function, and rename the functions to value change handler and call set entered value here, and then also input blur handler and call set is touched here. And when we return, I want to expose those functions. So I'll expose the value change handler and the input blur handler, so that these functions, which are defined in the hook, can be called from the place where the hook is being used. So can be called from the component that uses that hook. Now with that, we can use this custom hook in the simple input component. There, we can now import use input from, going up one level, hooks use input, and then call use input here, and then extract values from the result returned by use input. Use input returns such an object, hence we can use object destructuring to pull out those keys from that returned object and store the values in brand new constants. So we can, for example, extract the value and then also assign an alias with the colon here and name this entered name, and also pull out the has error state and maybe name this name input has error. Those aliases, of course, are up to you. And also extract the value change handler and give this an alias of name changed handler, and get access to the input blur handler and give it an alias of name blur handler, or something like this. So that this is how we use the hook. But we also need to pass a value into the hook, and that's this validate value function which we call here. So for this, we could define an inline function here where we get some value and then return the result of calling trim on that value and comparing it with an empty string. So the logic we have down there, just with value instead of entered name. Now this is an anonymous arrow function, which is not executed here, but defined here in line, which is then passed to use input. So it's received on this validate value parameter, and then this function here, which we define here, is actually executed in this line here. That's where it's being called. And the entered value, which is this state we're managing here, is the value passed into this function. Can be a bit tricky to wrap your head around, but in the end, it's just regular JavaScript where we are passing a function as a value to another function. And with that, we can customize the validation logic in the component where we need this hook and still execute it inside of the hook. And that now allows us to get rid of these two state slices here for the entered name. It allows us to get rid of these two constants here. Entered name is valid and name input is invalid. And instead use these pulled out constants here. And for example, here we are then actually missing information about the validity. We know if there is an error or not, but that's not just the validity, but the validity combined with the touched state. And therefore, to expose just the validity of an input to the component, I will actually also return value is valid here. Maybe on a is valid key, so that we also expose that information from the hook to the component where we use it. And then in the component, We can also extract is valid and store this in a entered name is valid constant by assigning this alias. And then entered name is valid can be used here again. Now we can get rid of the name input change handler function here and of the name input blur handler. And instead we'll use the name changed handler and the name blur handler, which we're getting out of the hook. So down there in JSX, I connect the name change handler and the name blur handler. Here, instead of using name input is invalid, I will use name has error, name input has error, which we're also getting from the custom hook. And then here, for the form submission handler, where I want to change the touched status and where I want to reset the form, we can get rid of this line of code because the form can't be submitted if the inputs are invalid anyways. So we don't need to mark the inputs as touched here. But of course, we want to be able to reset the form, and therefore we can go back to the custom hook and add a third function here, a reset function, where we simply call set entered value and set this to an empty string, and set is touched and set this to false. And then we just need to expose that so that we also return the reset function as a value in a reset key in that overall returned object. And in simple input.js, we can then get access to this reset function and maybe name it reset name input, give it this alias, and in the form submission handler, we can then just call reset name input here. Now down there, where we infer the CSS classes, I now want to use the name input has error data piece, which we get from the hook. And with that, if we reload, this name behaves just like before, and the overall form also behaves just like before. If I enter something valid here, we can submit it. If this is invalid, we can't. If I reload, if I click in there and out of there, it's invalid. This all works like before, but now with a custom hook, and now we can therefore also replace the email state, the entered email state, with our custom hook. Feel free to try this on your own. We're going to do it together in the next lecture.